As we continue, the remainder or the remnant of God's Old Testament people are now in captivity in far off Babylon. And we're reading some of the stories of what we sometimes call the time of exile, where God's people who had been driven out of Judah are now exiled and living in this foreign and godless land. Story 67, 3 men in the fiery furnace. Nebuchadnezzar the king made a statue of gold that was 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon, and then invited the princes, governors, captains, judges, treasurers, counselors, sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the statue. When they were all gathered, the herald cried out, "To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbus, psalter, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden statue that Nebuchadnezzar the king has erected. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall in that same hour be thrown into the middle of a blazing fiery furnace." Now, at the end of the last story, it almost sounded like Nebuchadnezzar had come to know the only true God and to acknowledge him as the God of gods. The problem is, Nebuchadnezzar may have only seen him as one God among many gods, a God that was maybe helpful to have around, but not the one and only true God that we have learned to know from the Bible. And so this was not out of line, and even though he had heard the vision, he still takes this very self-ingratiating step of building a statue and demanding that everyone worship it whenever they heard the sound of music. So when all the people heard the sound of the music, all the people and those of all the nations and languages fell down and worshipped the golden statue. At the same time, certain Chaldeans made accusations against the Jews. "You, O king, made a decree," they said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "that every man who hears the sound of the music should fall down and worship the golden statue. Whoever does not fall down and worship should be thrown into the middle of a blazing fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who have paid no attention to you. They do not serve your gods nor worship the golden statue that you set up." Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are accused of keeping the first commandment, even though it could potentially have meant their destruction. Then Nebuchadnezzar, furious in his anger, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought to him. When they were brought before him, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now if you are ready to fall down and worship the statue when you hear the sound of music, things will be all right with you. But if you do not worship the image that I have made, you shall be thrown immediately into the blazing fiery furnace. Who is the God who shall deliver you out of my hands?" He thinks he has a little more power than he actually does, doesn't he? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered, "Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves in this manner. If we are thrown into the furnace, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the blazing fiery furnace. He will deliver us out of your hand, O king. Even if we are not delivered, you should know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden statue that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar became enraged. His anger showed in his face, and his attitude toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego changed. He commanded that his men should heat the furnace 7 times more than it had been heated. Then he commanded the mightiest men in his army to tie Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing fiery furnace. The men, wearing their coats, all their clothes, their hats, and their other garments, were bound and thrown into the blazing fiery furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so exceedingly hot that the flame of the fire killed the men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The 3 fell, bound into the blazing fiery furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished. He sprang to his feet in amazement and said to his counselors, Didn't we tie up and throw 3 men into the fire?" "Certainly," they answered. "Look," he answered, "I see 4 men loose, walking in the middle of the fire. They have not been hurt. The 4th one looks like a son of God." Then Nebuchadnezzar went near the opening of the blazing fiery furnace and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you servants of the Most High God, come out, come over here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire. The princes, governors, captors, and king's counselors saw that the fire had had no effect on the men. Not a hair of their head was singed, their coats weren't scorched, and no smell of fire was on them. "Praise be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego," Nebuchadnezzar said, "who has sent his angel to deliver his servants who trusted in him. They disobeyed my word and were willing to give up their lives so they wouldn't have to serve and worship any god but their own God. There is no other God that can rescue like this." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. What may be one of the more familiar and maybe even more popular stories of the Old Testament, especially the later Old Testament, the story of the 3 men in the fiery furnace. They, by faith, attempted to keep the first commandment perfectly. And even in the face of being thrown into this fiery furnace, you gotta love their answer. "King, chill out. We know that our God can deliver us. And even if he should choose not to, won't change our attitude. We will continue to be faithful to him, and we will never worship another god." What a profound testament of faith. You know, in our world today, while it's nothing like the fiery furnaces back then, there are many who in our world, many who in our government, many who in our schools would love to require us Christians to worship in a certain way or to not say certain things. And if we continue to be faithful to God and his holy word, then they may very well try to silence us or to persecute us or to get us to shut up. And here we have a wonderful example of 3 men who would not bow to any kind of peer or governmental or supposed legal pressure. They remained faithful to their God. And then it probably shouldn't surprise us all that much that a 4th appears there in the fiery furnace, one who would come to deliver them. And perhaps even in this story we too can think of the one who would come later to deliver us from sin and from death and from Satan and yes, even from hell. For the one who came to set us free would also save us from the fires of hell so that we need not fear. And though things may not go well in this world at all times, we should never give up hope on God, and we should be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, knowing that that 4th character has come to save and rescue us, and our future in heaven for all eternity is now secure. In story 68, we learn of another king named Belshazzar. Belshazzar the king hosted a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine with them. As he tasted the wine, he commanded that the gold and silver vessels that his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem be brought out, so that the kings and his princes, his wives, and his concubines could drink from them. When they drank from them, they praised their gods of gold, silver, brass, iron, wood, and stone. So a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, is now ruling in Babylon, and he throws a big party, and he brings out the holy vessels from the temple in Jerusalem and uses them in a way very, very, very not in keeping with God's instructions. As they were drinking, fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote, near the candlestick on the plaster wall of the king's palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale. He was so terrified that his knees knocked against each other and his legs became weak. He shouted orders that the astrologers and the soothsayers be brought to explain the writing. All of the king's wise men came, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. He was frightened. He turned pale and was troubled, and his countenance was changed in him. His nobles were baffled by it all. Now the queen heard all the talking of the king and his nobles, and came into the banquet hall. "O king, don't be so troubled and look so pale," she said. "There is a man in the kingdom who has understanding and wisdom. Your ancestor, the king Nebuchadnezzar, placed him in charge of all the magicians, astrologers, and soothsayers. Since he has such excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding, and can interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems, call Daniel. He will tell you what this says." So Daniel was brought before the king. "Are you one of the exiles who was brought from Judah by my grandfather?" the king asked. "I heard you can explain things. Read for me this writing and tell me what it means. Then you will have a purple robe, a gold chain around your neck, and will be the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Daniel answered the king, "You can keep your gifts and give the rewards to others. I will read the message and interpret it for you, O king. The Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar, your grandfather, a kingdom with majesty, honor, and glory and honor. All peoples, nations, and languages feared him. When he became proud, however, he was deposed and his glory taken from him. He was driven into exile. Mentally, he was like an animal, living with wild donkeys and eating grass. He lived like this until he realized that the Most High God ruled human kingdoms. You certainly are his grandson, Belshazzar, for you have not humbled your heart either, even though you knew all this. You are fighting against the Lord of heaven also. They brought the vessels from the temple to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and concubines, have drunk wine from them, have praised the gods of silver, gold, brass, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see, which cannot hear or think. You don't honor the God who enables you to breathe, who controls all your ways. This is what the writing says. Min, tekel, parsin. This is what it means. Min means that God has numbered the days of your kingdom and has ended it. Tekel means that you have been weighed in the balance and have been found wanting. Perez means that your kingdom has been divided between the Medes and the Persians. Then Belshazzar commanded that Daniel be clothed with purple and that a chain of gold be placed around his neck. He also distributed a proclamation making Daniel the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That night, Belshazzar was killed, and Darius the Mede was made king when he was 62 years old. A relatively short story in many ways, but Belshazzar is throwing this, let's just call it a wicked party with no regard whatsoever for anything sacred or holy to the only true God. And this hand appears miraculously. And only Daniel can read it, with the help of God, of course. And he tells the king, look, your days are numbered. You've been found wanting, and your kingdom will be divided between the Medes. Now, Belshazzar was a Babylonian. And here Daniel tells him, your kingdom is going to be split up between the Medes and the Persians. So we're about to see the kingdom of Babylon come to an end. As a matter of fact, we're told that later that night, Belshazzar is killed, and Darius, the Mede, one of the Medes, takes over. And this marks the designation. Remember Nebuchadnezzar's vision? That big giant statue made of 4 different things. And Daniel said that Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians were the top item. Well, then the second kingdom that was to come along would be the kingdom of the Medes and Persians. And they will rule for several hundred years before the Greeks will take over that area of the world as well. So even in the story, or even in the telling of this story, we see God keeping his word and his promises. Which then brings us to another very well-known story in the late Old Testament, Daniel and the Lion's Den, story number 69. Darius thought it would be good to place 120 governors over the kingdom. Over these governors were 3 administrators. Daniel was one of these. Because of his excellent qualities, Daniel distinguished himself, and the king thought of placing him over the whole kingdom. Soon the governors and other administrators tried to find fault with his work so they could bring charges against him, but they could find nothing wrong because he was faithful and careful in what he did. We won't find anything in his work to charge Daniel with, these men said, unless we find it connected with how he worships his God. Probably tells us a little bit about Daniel. He was a faithful, one and only true God worshiper, and it was no secret. Others knew it as well. So these governors and administrators met with the king and told him, King Darius, live forever. All the governors, administrators, and princes, the counselors, and the general has agreed that the king should issue a royal decree, stating that whoever shall pray to any god or man during the next 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Sign the decree so that it can't be changed, just like the laws of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be changed. So King Darius signed the decree into law. Some of Daniel's co-workers, should we call them, or other government officials, or others who had designs on places of privilege and honor in the Medo-Persian kingdom, they were jealous of Daniel, and they wanted to get rid of him, but they knew it would only be somehow connected with his God. So they come up with this scheme, and they get the king to sign this decree, which in the ancient world, to the Medes and Persians, once the king signed it, it could not be changed or revoked or anything. And they get the king to sign, maybe without fully thinking. Maybe he didn't have a chance to read the whole bill before he signed it into law, as we sometimes hear our own government officials doing. But he did sign the decree, and the stage was set, and I'm sure Daniel's opponents thought, we got him. When Daniel learned that the writing had been signed, he went to his house, where the windows in his bedroom were open and faced toward Jerusalem. Here he kneeled 3 times a day and prayed, as he had done before. The men gathered as a group to watch. They saw Daniel praying and making supplication to his God. So they went to the king to talk to him about the decree he had signed. Didn't you sign a decree stating that every man who prays to any god or man during the next 30 days, except if they are praying to you, O king, shall be thrown into the lion's den? That is true, the king answered. Like the laws of the Medes and Persians, this law cannot be changed. Daniel, one of those brought from Judah as a captive, they told the king, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the decree you signed. He prays 3 times a day. When the king heard this, he was angry with himself. He tried to find a way to deliver Daniel, working until sunset to rescue him. When the men met again with the king, they said to him, You know, O king, that the law of the Medes and the Persians does not allow any decree or statute that the king has signed to be changed. Then the king commanded that Daniel be brought and thrown into the lion's den. May your God, whom you worship so faithfully, deliver you, the king said to Daniel. A stone was brought and placed over the opening to the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and the signet of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation would not be changed. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. Even though he couldn't sleep, no musical instruments were played. Early in the morning, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. When he was close to the den, he called to Daniel with an anguished voice, Daniel, servant of the living God, was your God, whom you serve so faithfully, able to rescue you from the lions? My God has sent his angel his messenger, Daniel answered, and has shut the lions' mouths. They have not hurt me because I am innocent in his sight. I have done nothing to hurt you either, O king. The king was overjoyed and commanded that they should take Daniel out of the den. When Daniel was brought out of the den, no type of wound was found on him because he believed in God. Then the king commanded that those men who had accused Daniel be thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. Before they reached the floor of the den, the lions tore them in pieces and broke all their bones. Then King Darius wrote to all the people who lived in the kingdom, "May you prosper greatly. It is my decree that in every area of my kingdom people shall fear and revere the God of Daniel. He is the living God, forever faithful, and his kingdom will last forever. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He has delivered Daniel from the lions." Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and during the reign of Cyrus the Persian. In this story, Daniel's opponents probably thought they had him. And a stone was rolled in front of the opening. It was sealed so there could be no monkey business. But in the morning, quite a surprise. And if he had been in there 3 days, maybe the connection would have been a little easier. But again, this angel or this messenger from God is sent who delivers Daniel, who shuts the lion's mouth. God delivers his people. God keeps his promises. God has a plan, and he will make sure that it is carried out in time. Of course, some would argue and say, well, Daniel got lucky. He was thrown in there at night. The lions weren't tired or weren't hungry. But we see from the details here that when those who accused Daniel, those troublemakers and their families were thrown into the lions, we're told before they hit the floor, the lions had torn them into pieces. So much for the lions not being interested or hungry. But again, this is an incredible story of deliverance. Now, we shouldn't necessarily think that Daniel was somehow without sin or anything like that. None of the Old Testament characters are ever that way. But again, just like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego earlier, he refuses to bow to the ungodly, to worship any other god, or to pay homage to them in any way. And Daniel is delivered. There is a story from the early church about a saint named Polycarp, kind of a funny sounding name. But Polycarp was an early Christian in the very, very earliest years of the church. And it was during a time when Christians were being persecuted, when they were being fed to lions in Rome, or when they were being burned at the stake. And Saint Polycarp, old man, is tied up on a pile of wood, about to be burned, and he is given a chance to deny his God and to save himself. And Polycarp is reported to have said something like this: "For these 87 years, God has taken care of me always, and there's no reason to doubt that he won't continue to do so even if you light this fire. And so no, I will not deny my God." The torch was then set to the fire, and Polycarp dies a martyr's death. But we see, and in this case, he was not delivered, as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had done. He was not delivered as Daniel had been delivered, and yet his faith remains secure, and we know that he has a place in God's kingdom forever, and that he too will live one day in glory with God forever. It is the kind of God that reveals himself to us in the Bible as able to deliver, and also a faithful God who is working even through Daniel, Shadrach, and Meshach, even through other characters that we'll meet, to preserve his people who will one day make their way back to Jerusalem, who will rebuild the temple and the walls of the city so that God's people can be there in Jerusalem when the promised Messiah to be born in Bethlehem was to arrive on the scene.